I think we've lost our capacity to hold pain, I think, and even discomfort. I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I think that we live in a culture that tells us that being vulnerable and being tender is being weak. And weakness is something that collectively we abhor. You know, we have no tolerance for weakness. I mean, to say we're sickened by weakness. And so culturally, I think there's this pushback to be strong, to put on your game face. And so I think culturally the message is weakness is, and I don't even think disgusting is too strong of a word in our culture. And so I think there's this cultural piece, but I also think that part and parcel of that is our unwillingness or our inability sometimes to hold space for pain and discomfort. And that's one of the things that I think faith communities, where they miss the mark sometimes, because I think often faith communities always perceive it as an unwillingness to be in the dark, an unwillingness to feel pain, an unwillingness to feel discomfort. But I would argue that it's not always an unwillingness, it's sometimes the inability. I don't know how. And you keep asking me to do this, but I physically, spiritually, emotionally, physiologically don't know how to sit in that. And I think that is, again, also born of our culture. And I see it when I interview parents who spend their whole lives about 3 feet ahead of their children, softening everything down, making sure everything is okay. You know, Pema Chodron, who is an American Buddhist nun, who I love her work, she defines compassion as knowing our darkness well enough that we can sit in the dark with others. And she says that compassion is not a relationship between the wounded and the healed, but a relationship of equals. And I think that's really powerful, because as a parent, I think one of the ways we start to change culture is when my kids are struggling, it's not my instinct, I'm not hardwired to let them struggle and sit in the dark and sit with them. I'm hardwired, I think, to flip on the lights. And so to me, we start teaching compassion and teaching the ability to hold space for pain and discomfort by sitting with our kids in the dark, rather than fixing them, letting them feel their way through. But I think I think when faith communities say, why aren't you willing to feel the pain? I think we have to go back even further and say, how can I help you learn how? How can I teach you how to hold space for this? And I think it's even a hardwiring issue. I think that's why we see, you know, a lot in my research, I talk about us being the most addicted, medicated, obese, and in debt, and busiest adult cohort in human history. I think numbing is one way, universally, that we have learned to manage discomfort. I don't think you can talk about individual and collective holding of vulnerability without talking about shame. Even in grief, people say don't wallow. And so the shame, the shame is this like universal human emotion that we all experience that tells us that we're not good enough and that we're not worthy of love and belonging, things that we're hardwired to experience. You know, where there's no love, where there's no belonging, there's suffering always. And so shame is this extremely effective emotion that says you're not good enough. And so one of the things, if we want to help people learn how to embrace vulnerability, we cannot do that without visiting shame and talking to people about what are the messages and expectations about being vulnerable that are stopping you. You know, for me, you know, I'm 5th generation Texan, very German American. There were just very unspoken messages in my family growing up. You know, we don't get sick, we don't miss work. You know, for me, to learn how to be vulnerable, which was not my natural way of being, I had to first address the gremlins. You know, the shame messages that said vulnerable people are weak, they're indulgent, they're lazy, they are, you know. And so once I understood those messages and where they came from, I could decide, make a conscious choice to say, I'm not buying into it. So I think the way we start, and this is another thing that we can't stand in our culture, we make change by addressing first what's getting in the way. You know, what are the messages and expectations that get in the way? When you look at men, I do a lot of work with men, and there was a great study that came out a couple years ago that talked about what are the qualities that are most important in our culture in the US for men to be considered masculine. And I think number 1, 2, and 3 were primacy of work, Nothing comes before work, not family, not partners, not faith. Nothing becomes before work. Number 2 was emotional stoicism. Show no emotion at all. And number 3 was power over women. You know, and then you look at what the top 3 for what are the most important norms for femininity in our culture: thin, nice, and quiet. And so you have to really address some pretty serious cultural messages and expectations before people are going to buy in and say, I'll give being tender a chance. You know what I mean? I mean, this is true.
Brene, come on, this is a bunch of hippie talk. Seriously, how, I mean,
I like hippies.
Faith communities, I mean, that's how we use shame, you know, we need that to create power. And if we don't hold shame, then how will we keep institutions alive and generate profits? Like this, carving out space for vulnerability, I don't think you can make money doing that, sweetie. Come on.
Well, it's interesting, I guess, because, you know, I study shame and spirituality, and not shame and spirituality, but shame and religion, and what people feel. Here's what's interesting. The men and women who I've interviewed who have pretty significant spiritual religious scars, what's interesting about them, this is all the questions I get: what denomination's worse? And there is not one, and that's also other researchers have validated it's across denominations. But here's what's interesting, that you will find clusters of people who have a lot of shame around their religious or spiritual upbringing within congregations. So it's not the denomination, it's not the belief system, it's how clergy, how men and women that are in power and running the church use shame. But here's what's interesting, which I think counters your point about making the cashola on the faith corp. That men and women who build shame resilience and find strength and kind of heal those spiritual wounds, 100% of the people I interviewed did that through spirituality. The abandonment of spirituality, the wholesale abandonment of it was never the answer to overcoming scars in that area. They may have changed congregations, they may have changed denominations, faith groups, you know. So I do think that people are hungry for it, but people are tired of the business side of it, to be honest with you. I mean, here's the thing. The best way for anybody to make money, not just the faith communities, but businesses, is to sell certainty. I mean, that's what, you know, people love that stuff. You know, you have them hook, line, and sinker if you'll sell them, you know, certainty. You'll sell, if you believe this is going to happen, period. If, you know, it's parenting the same way. You buy, you know, you have a parenting expert that says, do these 3 things, your kids will stay safe, sleep through the night, make friends, and go to Stanford. You know, people are going to buy that. So people love certainty. And so you have seen a lot of faith communities cash in on that. That we have the answers, and here, you know, and so then they do. But my belief is that faith minus vulnerability, when you equals fundamentalism and extremism. When you can't hold space for the questions, you bankrupt faith by definition. We live in totally uncertain times, politically, socially, economically, environmentally, spiritually. And so we are like big scarcity mongers. Like there's never enough of anything. There's not enough money, there's not enough safety, there's not enough certainty, enough perfection, enough extraordinary, you know, not enough joy. And so people who can sell that and market that do really pretty well. You know, I come from a world where, you know, if you can't measure it, you know, it doesn't exist. And now I've become a person who believes if you can't measure it, it's probably not that important. And so it's a hard thing to reconcile. But what has been the most surprising to me is the people that have reached out to me the most are like, you know, Fortune 200 companies. People want to bring me in. And I think, you know, I'm hopeful, but at the same time, this is not something that you're going to be able to parlay into some kind of trick. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like,
you can't fake it.
You can't fake this, and so, or you can't change it. You can't turn it into a business model. And I'll, you know, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and this has been very controversial about my work, especially with the communities I come from. I don't think you can do this without spirituality. Yeah, I just don't think you can, and I may have a broader definition of spirituality than a lot of people, But, you know, for me, spirituality is just this deeply held belief that we're inextricably connected to each other by something greater than we are, and something that's about love and compassion. And for me, that's God. But I think that third option that you describe, or the work that I describe, I don't know about most people. I can't sit in that alone. Yeah, I just can't sit in that alone. You know, I have to rely on faith. I have to rely on, and not faith as you know, I have a Richard Ward quote in my book that I love that says, you know, we say we're a people of faith, but we love certainty and closure and proof, and that, you know, by definition, that's not faith. You know, and so I can't sit in that third option without really believing in something bigger than me, and something that connects us all in an important way.